Hello, everybody. It's Jacqueline Novogratz back again um, to do a reading from my book, Manifesto for a Moral Revolution. Something I will do today and every weekday until May 26th, and I thank you for coming. The premise of this book is really that our current institutions have mostly run their course, built for an age where too often we put at the center of our systems the idea of success being determined by money, profit, fame, power. And in an interdependent world, what we need are systems that put our shared humanity and the preservation and sustainability of the earth at the center. And the issue is we haven't reimagined yet exactly how to build that. And so the Manifesto for a Moral Revolution is essentially a set of operating principles and practices that are not soft skills, they're hard skills. They're essentially the skills that we need to cultivate in all of ourselves for the 21st century. I've spoken about the moral imagination and listening and frankly redefining success. But one of the most important skills that we need to cultivate and nurture in ourselves and others is that of navigating identity. Too often in the world, we're seeing identity being used as a weapon to divide us, to reinforce a sense of in-group or a sense of out-group. And yet, none of us is a single identity. We're a mix are many, many different component parts, and those parts fluctuate in importance. And that's really at the heart of what this chapter is about. I chose the title, You Are an Ocean in a Drop, motivated by the 13th century Sufi poet Rumi, who wrote, "You are not just a drop in the ocean. You are the ocean in a drop." Each of us contains, as Walt Whitman would say, multitudes. And if we could draw on those many different parts of ourselves, see those many different parts in others, we would have a point of connection. And that would be a much healthier starting point to build systems, businesses, nations, families that can integrate our diversity and build a sense of wholeness. So here is an excerpt from the book, You Are the Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, called You Are the Ocean in a Drop. As I went on to experience more people and places, the various parts of my identity became more nuanced. As the saying goes, you will never know the east side till you move to the west. By working and living in other countries, I began to see America, the land of my birth, in more complex ways. I loved my country's ideals and felt grateful daily to be an American woman. We are a can-do nation of immigrants from all corners of the globe, exuberant in our sense of possibility, proud to be a place where anyone, regardless of birth status, can achieve greatness. Even today, when I run along the Hudson River, I silently salute Lady Liberty, gratefully acknowledging her welcoming promise to all people seeking to make their lives on her shores and to contribute to the American experiment. Yet just as with Catholicism, I also grew an awareness of the more shameful parts of my American identity, which continue to limit the nation's full potential. This includes the legacies of American imperialism suffered by Native Americans, the still open wounds of slavery, and the unjust number of incarcerated young men of color. I began to recognize that every one of us and every society as a whole is a mix of light and shadow. In that realization, I found, and continue to find, extraordinary potential for growth, for relationships and self-discovery, for a new idealism grounded in the gritty, sometimes ugly, realities of everyday work to be done. 30 years after that conversation with my father, I feel profoundly grateful for my multiple identities, both inherited and chosen. Each part of me is a chance to connect to others. Growing up in a big immigrant family made interacting with more community-oriented people in Asia, Africa, Latin America feel closer to home for me. My Catholic upbringing helped me connect to other traditional religious communities as I understood what it meant to prioritize family, daily rituals, and prayer, and to honor religious leaders who interpret holy texts. The daughter of an army colonel, I am comfortable considering myself a citizen soldier, and I respect the discipline, diversity, and leadership grown by the military. As a New Yorker, I feel a kinship to residents of big cities such as Mumbai and Karachi, Nairobi, and Lagos. My inherited love of literature has connected me to new places by making conversations with strangers easier, providing a means of conveying curiosity rather than tired assumptions about their societies. Each of us contains a multitude. The more identities we carry within, the more chances to discover that we are at once unique and bounded by commonalities. So as the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie asks, why then do we reduce individuals to a single story, a single identity that can too easily be infused with our greatest fears about one another? I witnessed firsthand the fragility and potential deadliness of reductive identity during the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. I sat in foul prisons listening to women whom I had considered friends rant about the evil of the Tutsis, while fully believing the Tutsis would have murdered the country's other main tribe, the Hutus, had not the Hutus killed them first. Those encounters taught me that monsters and angels exist in every one of us. Our monsters are the broken parts of ourselves, the shames and hurts and grievances often carried from generation to generation. If we do not confront them peacefully, yet directly, those broken parts make us vulnerable to externalizing our pain through anger, violence, or deadening bitterness. In times of insecurity, divisive language and policies of demagogues prey upon our weaknesses, urging us to cast blame for our problems on those who are too often deemed other. Such language successfully entreats us to do horrendous things to one another. I have lost too many friends to violence in the name of identity. Perhaps this is why I believe so strongly in the Lebanese French writer Amin Malouf's explanation in his book In the Name of Identity, of how identity operates within each of us. According to Malouf, we each maintain a hierarchy of identities that rise and fall depending on whether a particular identity is threatened. When one of our identities is attacked, it becomes easy to perceive ourselves only as that identity, for how others see us can have significant impact on how we see ourselves. Think about your own diverse identities, your gender, religion, race, ethnicity, tribe, sexual identity, citizenship, or refugee status, your schools. Which parts give you pride? Which parts shame? I'd be surprised if most didn't give you both. You might be a vegetarian or a carnivore, an extrovert or an introvert, an athlete, someone who loves classical music or hip hop, novels or nonfiction, a nature lover or an urbanite. Likely, your mix includes at least a few contradictions. Our personal commitments form aspects of our identities too. Now think of those times when a single part of you felt threatened and you were reduced, either by others or yourself, to a single identity. The world plays along in these moments, flattening our sense of self to the point of caricature. My own identity shapeshifts when confronted with the world around me. I feel more American when I am being questioned at a dinner party in Karachi about U.S. drone policy. When I am held at U.S. immigration for questioning because of all the Pakistani stamps in my passport, I become equally a global citizen and an American who wants my country to treat immigrants with greater respect. Perhaps, instead, we could start by understanding the many identities inside ourselves, avoid the temptation of labels and the demonization of others, and search for common ground in those who might seem different at first blush. If holding our multiple identities and recognizing that all people carry myriad identities within themselves is a crucial step toward navigating difference in an interdependent world, a second essential skill is understanding how others perceive you, especially with regard to power and privilege. Throughout my 20s, I sharpened the first skill by interacting with other cultures. In my early 30s, a painful conversation and confrontation with the more privileged parts of my identity had to take place before I could fully learn the second. In 1996, Peter Goldmark and Angela Blackwell, president and senior vice president, respectively, of the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, determined to build a leadership program to confront the fault lines of race, class, and ideology in America. 4 years earlier, Los Angeles had exploded with riots over the acquittal of police officers who'd brutally beaten Rodney King, an African-American motorist. The 1991 beating had been caught on video and seen hundreds of millions of times, before smartphones or Facebook. Because of the riots that followed the beating, more than 2,300 people were injured, 62 were killed, and the city experienced a loss of more than $1 billion. Over the next 4 years, across the United States, identity politics grew more hostile. The Rockefeller Foundation's most senior leadership wanted to try to do something about a deteriorating civic conversation in America. The two leaders of the foundation tapped me to create and lead this new program. I had already learned something about navigating differences while working in Rwanda, and I had tried to become a respectful listener as well. I loved the idea of confronting the fractures of American democracy through investing in diverse young leaders, and was elated to build a program that would support their development. At the same time, I also felt that I was exactly the wrong person to lead that program. I was white. My orientation was more global than local. I had dreamed of investing in businesses that served the poor, not supporting individuals to lead. However, the need was there, the opportunity was there, and no one else had stepped in to build something like it. My mentor, John Gardner, whom you met in Chapter 1, reminded me to be more interested than interesting. You will learn to understand the rest of the world better, he said, if you do the work to know your own country. You'll be able to speak with greater humility if you can speak from experience about the challenges that your own country faces. After much thought, I decided to start a new chapter in my life and let the work teach me. Together with a small, diverse, and mighty team, I helped create the Next Generation Leaders Program. The scope of our ambition thrilled me, though when we started I had no idea at all that I'd have to learn to give the program even the slightest chance of success. On the first evening of the NGL Fellows Gathering, as everyone sat down to dinner, I formally introduced myself. 24 fellows sat around a horseshoe-shaped table representing diverse slices of the American pie, including a Korean-American leader of a community group from New York City, an African-American leader fighting to eliminate the death penalty, a fighter pilot in the Marines, and a gay Latina activist for immigrant rights, just to name a few. After welcoming these fellows, I began. I hope we will use the group itself not only to explore differences, but to understand one another, so that we, in turn, might better understand ourselves. Heads nodded as I spoke. Though I was nervous, I thought, so far, so good. Given our diversity, I continued, we also hope to define rituals as a means of creating shared experiences and thus bonds among us. Each night before dinners together, I suggested a different fellow start the meal by sharing a poem, a blessing, a quote, a moment of silence. Each fellow could choose whether to share his or her own tradition, whether religious or atheist, or to honor another one. What mattered was the fellow's gift of reflection and an openness from the rest of the group to receive it. An African American minister from Chicago stood up that first evening, choosing traditional words of thanksgiving for the meal we were about to eat, and ending with a quiet amen. Many in the group repeated the amen, but a young African American activist stood and accused me of, quote, making this a Christian thing. I reiterated that we hoped to create the space not for what separated us, but for what we shared. He fired back that people shouldn't be forced to hear dinner-time prayers. Heads nodded in agreement. Over the next few months, the groups regularly devolved into arguments about identity rather than focusing on how we might actually solve problems. I hired 2 elderly white scholars to lead Good Society sessions, a powerful exercise taken from the Aspen Institute, in which participants reflect on their own values by interacting as a group with the writings of philosophers and activists spanning from Plato to Hobbes, Rousseau, King, and Mandela. Upset that the readings mostly came from dead white men, some of the fellows refused to participate. I did not know how to handle the situation, and the 2 facilitators ultimately left the session. The same young man who had raised issues around having a minister share a prayer made it clear from the beginning that I, a white woman of privilege, should not run a program built for a diverse collection of emerging American leaders. Part of me thought he was right. My own insecurities stunted my ability to bring my whole self forward, though that was precisely what I was asking the group to do. Ultimately, the group avoided rigorous debates about how society might do better at encompassing our diversity. Opinions, not reason, dominated. Some fellows remained so busy defending their own identities that we collectively failed to make the effort to engage at all with the identities of others. The lowest point of the year occurred at the end of a seminar during a go-round in which each fellow shared an insight or question from the week's activities. When it was the African American activist's turn, he suggested that this was the right moment for me to resign. I thanked him for his comments, but I had no answers. Not for the unasked questions swirling in the room, and not even for the questions I posed myself. The weight of the room's silence and the staring eyes of the fellows pressed in on my chest, intensifying my feelings of shame and guilt. Even though I'd put heart and soul into working with my team to create and fund this program, and had delivered on the promise of a group that reflected America's diversity, I had failed to facilitate difficult yet constructive conversations. For nearly an entire year, I had been unable to build a sense of wholeness and a connected group that could learn from itself. And rather than share the burden of failure with the group, I erred in thinking that the program's deficiencies were the sole responsibility of me and my team. Later that night, after a good cry, I finally came to a reckoning with myself. The young activist had pinpointed one of the most unresolved parts of my identity, my privilege. It didn't matter how I perceived myself. What mattered in that moment was how others saw me. Until that experience, I saw myself as an industrious woman from a big middle-class family who had paid her way through college and business school and who would face the monthly stress of school debt repayment for yet another decade. As a young person, I was aware that being a white American afforded me vastly better opportunities, but I also wanted to claim the scrappy, independent woman part of my identity that was unafraid of sweat and hard work. Yet if I did not fully see myself as a woman of privilege, My identity had expanded to include working at the Rockefeller Foundation with a well-used passport and a Stanford MBA. If I hadn't been born an elite, I had certainly become one, regardless of how I saw myself. Only when I was able to integrate the person I had become with the person I once was would I be able to serve in ways that mattered. Finally, I understood. By hiding parts of my identity, I had been denying myself and others what I could bring to the table. Because I had not laid the groundwork to know myself and claim a legitimacy for running the program, I had never been able to address the polarization that held the room hostage to identity politics and made it difficult for everyone to focus on the issues at hand. I'd failed to recognize that identity, our own and that of others, is always in the room. Given all this, should I then resign? My resolve came slowly and clearly. No, absolutely not. That young activist did not have the sole hold on what was right and fair. There were many in the groups who told me privately and repeatedly that they were acquiring new insights and skills, and they urged me to stay the course. So I would take this as an opportunity to grow personally and to expand my understanding of both the challenges and opportunities identity brings. I also realized in those days and weeks of reflection that we would succeed in building a cohort of diverse leaders who worked across lines of difference only if we selected people who were open to changing themselves. Without personal transformation, a moral revolution is impossible. By the second year of the fellowship, I was able to leave with greater self-awareness and confidence. Rather than simply checking or distancing myself from privilege, I learned to know when and how to use that privilege of authority as an asset to create space so that other voices could be heard. I was more able to recognize and call out when a fellow holding tightly to an ideological stance on either side, either extreme of the political divide was making constructive conversation impossible. When a fellow complained in that first year that the Rockefeller Foundation represented the imperialist capitalist elite, I simply stared, almost fearing to respond. But during the second year, I made it clear that everyone in the room, by virtue of choosing to join the fellowship, would have a new element to his or her identity. As fellows, they would have greater access and privilege that in turn required additional responsibilities. I understood, finally, that my job was to make the conversation safe enough for all sides to feel deeply uncomfortable at times, and to grow from it. It was to challenge anyone who was throwing around easy assumptions, asking them instead to ground their perspectives in principles for which they stood. It was to remind myself and every one of the fellows that if every one of us were not open and willing to change ourselves, we would never be able to change the world. That included me. My painful stumbles at the Rockefeller Foundation gave me a powerful new set of skills with which to navigate identity. First, know yourself. Second, be open to the multiple identities others might carry within themselves. Third, the person or organization with greater power in a particular moment must be the bridge that extends understanding to those with less power. Without this bridge, real conversations won't happen. Keep in mind that privilege tends to fluctuate depending on context. Every one of us might feel powerful in certain situations and powerless in others, based on how we perceive ourselves and how others impose on us their ideas of who we are. The more you are aware of the power you maintain in each situation, the more likely you are to gain a truer understanding of others. Though I could not have known it at the time, in pushing me way beyond my comfort zone, that painful year with the Rockefeller Foundation's leadership program broke me open and allowed me to stretch to find new parts of myself. I don't say this lightly. I realize that knowing all the parts of ourselves and being aware of how others see us is more of a struggle for some than for others. And it can be more challenging at various stages in our lives. Moreover, some people have single identities imposed on them in ways that can be life-threatening. This is precisely why understanding identity, which is wholly different from learning to play identity politics, is such an important skill to teach and to learn. We grow not in easy times, but in difficult times. In our moments of greatest division and fear, might we all become less comfortable and forge more nuanced understandings of our own identities, thereby opening ourselves to explore the identities of others. Thanks for listening. And I'm going to just check the questions that you might have. Beautiful, beautiful comments that are coming through, and I really appreciate that. How should we react when others reduce us to a single identity? I think that is one of the hardest questions that we have to confront. One, I think it's to, again, know yourself and to recognize that no real conversations exist on one level. Those conversations are always existing on multiple levels: the identity level, the content level, the emotion level. And so if someone says, well, you're just that, is to not go defensively, but to find ways to connect with the other person. Sometimes it's heartbreaking when that happens. And as I said, given what's happened recently in the United States with too many killings of people because of their race or their religion, you don't always have time to interact with the person on the other side of the table. I am fully aware of that. But to go from that place of moving into where might you connect, always to ask questions. Again, I say this with great humility. When there's time, I've been in so many situations where I've seen people yelling at each other about identity. I once had a dinner party during a war in another country where there were members of the two different sides, and they ended up leaving in different elevators. They couldn't bear to be with each other, and I felt like it was such a failure because I had not allowed them to unpack. Like, wait a minute, you're both New Yorkers. Let's just start right there. And so sometimes I think it is easier when there is a moderator, but I probably have 3,000 stories of opportunities to ask questions, to find that place where you connect with someone on the other side. One of my great stories was a guy named Golela, a South African, who was Steve Biko's neighbor. Steve Biko was one of the great liberators who fought against apartheid and was tragically killed in a prison because of his identity and because of standing up for justice in the way that he did. And I wanted Zolela to go meet a military general who was the head of a movement that was arguing for a white state in South Africa. And he didn't want to go at first because he was afraid of this man who represented everything that was wrong with the country and that had led to the death of this hero of his. But he trusted me and I trusted him, and we went to meet this general, and it could have been a disaster of a conversation with the two of them flinging identity. But in part inspired by the extraordinary moral leadership of Nelson Mandela, we looked for that common ground. And it turns out Zolela went to the same university as this general, And they were both lovers of Afrikaans literature, Afrikaans being the language of the white South African from the Transvaal, from the real heartland. And before we knew it, the two of them were exchanging poems that opened up such a fulsome conversation where they spoke truths to each other. And when we left that meeting, Zolela actually said something that Mandela and Martin Luther King said many times. Give me a conservative who will speak their truth rather than a moderate who tells me what he thinks I want to hear. And so by connecting with another part of each other's identity than the one that they both could see, they were able to create a field, if you will, that allowed much harder truths to be discussed. So with all humility, there's a real opportunity there for us to find ourselves in each other. I actually would love to have this conversation for about 3 hours because I think it's one of the most important ones we have. But I've promised a 30-minute slot for these readings, and so thank you for listening. Again, the book is Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, and there are so many more stories about identity and other principles. And connected to the book, Acumen Academy at Acumen Academy/Moral Revolution has a master course for the book, as well as many, many courses online. Many of them are free, to help those of you who want to do more around creating change in the world. But until May 26th, if you buy the book, the master course that I teach along with many of the people that you will read about in the book is free. So come join us, and whatever you're doing in the world, I wish you good luck in doing it, and doing so on a path. This is about the path of human imperfection that is focused on mastering the skills, the attributes, most importantly, the character of moral leadership. Have a beautiful day.